Definitely a very anticipated and relevant subject that our experts are going to take us through. So many of you met Marcus yesterday. He's from TAF Law and is an overall expert in ERP and digital transformation and data when it comes to the legal side. So he will provide a lot of perspective on how we can make sure those SOWs are tightened up when it comes to data, and answer any questions that you might have on that side of the legal perspective. And then I'm happy to welcome to the floor Daryl Crockett, who is a world-renowned thought leader on cybersecurity, data security, and data privacy. She acts as many of our expert witnesses for ERP implementations and many that end in data disasters. So definitely really grateful to have her thought process on this very, very complex subject. So with that, we have one question to kind of start everybody off, kind of create some momentum in the chat box. So when it comes to cybersecurity, what scares you most? So put your answer in the chat box, and Daryl and Marcus, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be back. And I'm excited to present with Daryl. I haven't seen Daryl for quite some time, since the last conference. I think it was in Denver. So it's an exciting opportunity to speak with Daryl, and it's always good to speak with her about this particular topic.
It's good to see you too, Marcus. Absolutely.
All right, let's get going here. All right. So you know, Kyler kind of gave a brief introduction to us, but Daryl, why don't you kind of tell everybody about all the great things that you do and your experience?
Well, I hope people find it interesting. I like data a lot, so I'm very into these topics, as I think you'll find out if you haven't seen me speak before. Deep experience in this space for sure. And then in other, kind of more or less obvious aspects of data, in terms of data cleansing and data procurement type of data cataloging, and all of that kind of foundational stuff that companies use as part of their supply chain. That's another element, in addition to the data cyber and security aspects and privacy for sure. And then also, with a background as a CFO, I mean, that's really used to be the front line of data. And now, of course, we have so many other titles and so many other roles associated with data privacy, data security, data management. But definitely been in the field a long time, and it continues to grow.
Yeah, it's an evolving field. And I first got into it about 20 years ago after graduating from law school. And it really wasn't called data privacy necessarily. I mean, what we were focusing on back then was really, confidentiality issues, trade secret issues. And then as things kind of progressed, it was really data migration, data conversion. These kinds of things were rearing their ugly head when I was in-house at both SAP and at Infor. And I think, my experience really is obviously on the legal side and from kind of the regulatory and transactional side. And so my core experience is certainly with intellectual property, drafting and negotiating ERP-related contracts and NDAs and confidentiality agreements. And I think, the value of having us both together doing this presentation for you really is, you're going to get a 1-2 punch. You're going to get deep data, a deep data dive, so to speak, right? And then I think you're going to get kind of more of an overall regulatory perspective. And I think the nature of the presentation, that has to be somewhat, from a 10,000 foot level. But then you also get kind of, from both of us, I think, really just a practical understanding of how this stuff really plays out in the context of an ERP integration and implementation.
Yeah, and before we go on too, I do want to say that, just from my experience, the data aspect of any ERP implementation is so underserved. And we've done a lot of work in the area of, how to not only this conversation, protect your data, protect it from a privacy standpoint, from an exfiltration or a threat standpoint. We'll talk a lot about that today. But I also don't want to put on the shelf. I want to kind of bring it off the shelf and talk about the fact that data is just really the integral part of everything that you're doing when you do a digital transformation or an ERP implementation. I mean, it's really the only reason why you're putting a system in is to be able to get good data out of it. And that's really what we want, is trusted data. But we also want the secure data. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today.
Yeah,
so it's not. So go ahead. You go ahead.
I was going to add to that. I mean, I think, and I might have gotten this from you. I mean, data is the water for the pipes, right? I mean, the only reason that you're going through an ERP integration or implementation process is because you're trying to get more value from the data. And if the data isn't converted properly, if there's issues in the data, then it's really all for naught. And certainly, if your data is compromised from a breach, then you've got a million other issues that you've got to deal with as well.
Right. Then the ERP implementation becomes the least of your worries at that time. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think with that as a backdrop, I mean, this slide here, it really is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I think if you look at the statistics that we see on a regular basis, it's anywhere from 50 to 60% of organizations are going to suffer or have suffered some sort of a data breach or a data incident, and it can be from a variety of sources, and the reason for that can be varied. I mean, it can be just a traditional phishing attack, which we'll get into in a second. It can be something on the scale of a SolarWinds issue, or it can be just a simple thing where someone is careless with the way that they process data internally. And we had one incident where we represented a bank, and they were transferring actual physical copies of documents in a truck to another site. The back door opens, and all of their data is strewn across 290 here in Chicago. And you talk about a data breach. I mean, that's an old school significant issue that happened, and how do you even clean that up and deal with it? So fundamentally, you don't need to think of this as just a technology issue. It's a data issue, and it really is not if it's going to happen to you. It's when and how you get prepared for it and what you do in response.
Oh, I'm so excited about this. We're going to talk about, I have got some all new information from the front lines. I just got back from London and meeting with my digital privacy and digital security teams. And so I've got some really interesting news and kind of leading edge stuff that we're going to talk about today. Really excited. All right, let's go back in time now, back to the future. Here we go. Hard to believe we'd say back in the day of 2013, but here we are.
Yeah, I can talk about this one if you like. I mean,
go ahead. Yep.
This is really kind of the lay of the land and what we were dealing with, right? And I think from a basics perspective, you're still dealing with this, but it has gotten fundamentally more complicated today. I mean, I think this was the scheme that we had been dealing with for many years. Identity theft, stolen credit cards, violated privacy policies by a company with respect to the way that they handle your data, and this was all fundamentally in the realm of either the criminal law or civil actions with civil fines and civil penalties. And then you got a little bit more on the regulatory side with certain statutes. You've got HIPAA, which would govern the way that healthcare providers would treat what I would call personally identifiable information. To prevent health data abuse. You've got financial data abuse under the FCRA and the GLBA, and then you've got issues associated with how children interact with data, which is governed by COPA. And of course you've got which seem to be relatively ineffective things like the TCPA and certain do not call laws that are supposed to deal with invasive marketing, which clearly, based on the number of calls I get to replace my car warranty, or whatnot, they're certainly not very effective, right?
No, it's definitely not working. I think we all can agree with that. I don't think we have to put a question out there to ask, is everybody really irritated by the number of robocalls they're getting, and do they consider that to be an invasion of their privacy? For sure. And don't you ever wonder, how did they get my number? I'm pretty careful about using my mobile number in particular, but it is just astounding that one time you put it down for some reason because they need to get in touch with you on your mobile phone. It could be at a car dealership. It can be at a even in a restaurant for getting seated. And then all of a sudden, about a week later or 2 weeks later, you're just barraged with calls until you get through that cycle of them having sold your number. And, they may not even have known that your number was being used. It can be stolen by employees who are taking it from that database where they're very lax, or they already have somebody inside their system that is just mining those numbers, and the company has no idea that this is being sold. So it's pretty scary, and it's almost a losing battle with regard to the robocalling for sure. But I've got a couple tips for you later on.
Good, yeah, and they're getting incredibly sophisticated. I mean, they ghost the numbers, so it looks like something that is coming from a number that's similar to yours, or for me, they make it look like it's coming from a law firm, and I'm thinking there's some level of credibility associated with that, and it's the same robocall that I continually get, and lately it's been senior benefits, and I'm not sure why that's the flavor of the month.
That's my call. That's for me. All right. This is all you for sure.
Okay. So today, this is the regulatory framework for the most part that we're dealing with. Okay. You've got TCPA Part 2, which is really trying to put the screws to the calls that we just talked about. Do not call, do not text. Leveraging severe civil penalties associated with people that violate that. You've got payment card industry data security standards, which deal with how things like EDI and just payment card processing is supposed to be handled. You've got something that I find very interesting. It's these ISO NIST SOC audits where you actually get a third party to come in and verify that your data hygiene is up to certain standards and it can be verified so that people know that you're safe to deal with. That's not necessarily a legal requirement necessarily, or a law, but that's something that people readily do. You've got regulations that deal with how you're going to contract with the government. You've got New York specific finance statutes here that deal with New York specific issues. And then you've got this model insurance data security law. But for my purposes, what I deal with on a very regular basis, most of these things are kind of tangential to my practice. Okay. Mm-hmm. In the ERP space, the thing that comes up the most often are these two here, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which was enacted in May of 2018, and then a relatively new law, which is California specific, but it's got massive implications for the industry, the California Consumer Privacy Protection Act, the CCPA, which really kind of dovetails into the GDPR. And when you are engaging vendors, and we'll get into this in much more detail, you have to make sure that they are compliant to the extent that they are what you would call, a data processor, data controllers. There's different nomenclature for all of these things, but to the extent that they're processing the data, personally identifiable information of your customers, you want to make sure that they're doing it in accordance with these regulations. And there's some nuance to this that we'll get into, whether someone's an EU citizen or not, is it impacting California or not? But this is kind of the landscape and the lay of the land now, at least with respect to the deals that I do and the things that I see on a regular basis. And like I said, we'll talk about some of the specifics.
And what's really important here, one of the most salient points I think that we can bring up here You can say today as a business, well, I don't have a lot of European customers, so therefore GDPR doesn't apply to me. Okay, certainly we can argue that there's a lot more companies affected by GDPR than they think. They just haven't been dinged yet. They just haven't had a problem yet. And you can say, okay, I'm not a California business, so therefore I'm not subject to the CCPA. Okay, but what you got to be thinking about now is that with the change in administration, there's definitely a movement now toward federal legislation for not only data privacy, but data security. And you're going to see that in the next 2 years. And that's why I'm really happy that you guys are all here today and you're taking this seriously. Because if you're planning a digital transformation, if you're planning an ERP, that's exactly the right time to start the groundwork for this. It's a time to get your data in order. With regard to privacy and security, because you're just going to have to do it again later, and you're going to have to almost rip that thing out again and put it back together again in order to implement the things that are coming down the road. So if you're thinking about it, please make sure that you're taking this seriously. Make sure that you're having discussions with us or whomever to get some advice on what you should be planning for this aspect of data privacy and data security with regard to the ERP. So you don't have to spend a whole nother bunch of money a second time in order to enact what is coming for legislation, we think, in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's virtually guaranteed. And the issue is, today there is essentially no federal data privacy law. It's a patchwork, a quilt, if you will, of individual regulations and state laws, and they all kind of work together or not so well work together. Yeah, right, exactly. And yeah. I think, when you look at things like the GDPR and the California statute, that's really kind of, I think, where things are going to go. And if they're going to enact something on the federal level, it's going to be replicating some of the best practices that you see in those two statutes. And so you might as well get compliant now, which is essentially what this is about. This next slide here, focusing on survivability. It's not necessarily, tunnel vision on data privacy necessarily. It's compliance with the processes that you utilize in order to manage your data, making sure people are complying with whatever regulations that they need to comply with. And then on the back end, having a measured approach for dealing with how you're going to be affected by any of these things. If you have a data breach, what are the steps that you're going to take to mitigate both your liability, the damage, and from a reputational standpoint? I mean, what's going to happen to your company? I mean, God forbid you have a SolarWinds incident or a breach on the scale that Target had. You've got stock, your stock goes down, shareholders are fleeing, you're firing CEOs. I mean, that seems almost fanciful that would happen to a medium to small size business, but it very well could. Absolutely seeing it every day. And what I want people to really understand is that even if you're really on top of your game and you've got a great MSSP, a managed security service provider, and they're managing your data security and your cybersecurity, you're still only 90% protected, because approximately 10% of what's out there is what we call not yet known 0-day events. In other words, the first day that we know as a public about a particular threat is not yet occurred. So think of it like an iceberg, really. 90% of it you might know about and you're hoping, but there's still that piece there that you're gonna be exposed to, possibly at any point in time, but nobody knows to tell you about it. And that's really the facts of the matter. And honestly, we're seeing it's very close to 100% of businesses that have any kind of internet presence, any kind of access to the internet, are now being attempted to be attacked every single day. And it's only by sheer luck, I feel like, every day that a business gets through it without having some sort of a breach. And most people, they don't even know about the breaches that they have. And that's the sad part. Yeah, and I mean, think about those statistics for a second. 100% of businesses with an internet presence.
Yeah.
And then the majority of people don't even know it's happening. I mean, that's just shocking, you know.
It is, and it's amazing to watch the threats come in. So let's move along, because I've got some really exciting stuff to tell people that are scary, whatever you want to call it, but definitely some cool stuff.
Yeah. And I think here, you know, look, this is just the way business is conducted today, right? I mean, Daryl's statistics bear this out. And, you know, if you fail to plan for what's coming and you fail to plan appropriately to protect your data, you know, not only are you going to be uncompetitive, you may not even be in business at all, right? Because you will have become the victim of a hack. But I think, you know, the gold and then their hills, at least from my perspective, is that you can do this, you can come up with a plan, and you can comply with whatever regulations that are going to be enacted in a measured and reasonable way for a reasonable cost, and mitigate both the likelihood that you're going to have an incident or a breach and any kind of resulting damages and liability that come from that.
And I think it's even more. I think that data security done well, even though we all know it's a pain, we're out there today. I know I am as a consumer looking for companies to do business with that I feel like I can trust. And if they don't have two-factor authentication, if they don't have security that seems to be a priority for them as a business, at this, where maybe 2 years ago I might have been annoyed, today I'm pleased. And I feel like that becomes a competitive advantage. And also there's one more nugget in there, or vein, if you want, that we can talk about. And that's the fact that done correctly, you have the ability to in this process of making yourself more secure by doing your data mappings, by understanding where you're putting your information and how you're cataloging the data that is coming in, you actually, through this exercise, will have a much better knowledge of the data that you have and more access to the data that you're legitimately collecting and keeping securely. You'll have access to that data within reason of privacy, obviously, but you'll have access to tremendous amount of information that you don't even know you need right now. That's one of the side benefits, the positives of an exercise of really getting a good policy and practice in place for data privacy and security.
Yeah,
all right, so let's go on. Let's see, what do we got next here? All right, this is yours, I think. There.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can. The beauty of us presenting together is we can both talk, you know, about all of this stuff. But I think certainly, you know, from a digital transformation standpoint, this is really kind of the like I say, you know, the lay of the land, right? And what I was talking about yesterday is, you know, it's not, if something's going to fail, it's not because of a technology issue necessarily, right? I mean, the software works, and here, you know, it plays out in a similar vein in that, you know, it's not a technology issue on the implementation side, it's a people issue, right? In here, from a data privacy perspective, it is absolutely a people issue. It's a social process. Look at all of the people that you have coming into your system, your network, on-site, you know, remote, whatever it is. You've got third-party consultants. They're not necessarily your consultants. They're the software vendors' consultants. They're the system integrators' consultants. You may not even know who they are. You don't have any idea, you know, where your data is being accessed from or by whom. You know, it's not uncommon for all this stuff to be offshored. You've got information technology support personnel, you know, in Jakarta, in the Philippines, wherever it is. You've got another layer, you know, within the vendors of administrative support personnel. And like I said, you know, you've got even once more removed with independent contractors. They're not even employees, so they're not under the direct control of the particular vendor that you've got. You know, and I think, you know, this is a little bit tongue in cheek. You know, if you're really unlucky, you're going to deal with lawyers, and that's sure. But I think, you know, what you want to do, and I said this yesterday, early legal advice is not expensive. Okay, it's late legal advice that becomes incredibly draining and financially difficult to support. But if you've got competent legal counsel on the front end that are drafting the contracts with these individuals that put into place the right provisions, whether it's confidentiality provisions, data processing addendums, limitations of liability that provide you with some meaningful relief, warranties and representations regarding viruses, a procedure and a process for dealing with data breaches. Those are all the kinds of things that you want to put in on the front end to give you a dog in the fight on the back end. When something happens, you've got a contract that you can point to and it says, look, you were accessing and processing my customer's data. There has been a breach. Here's the indemnity provision. Here's the liability cap associated with that. Here's the insurance obligation that you were supposed to maintain. And here's exactly what's going to happen. That's the level of specificity that you want to manage the social process, because it's the only way that you can really get through it, right? And that's, like I said, that's on the front end of an ERP implementation process. And we're not even talking about, your data being in the cloud at some unknown environment that Salesforce is accessing and managing for you, and they've got a breach. I mean, to some extent, I guess we are, because the contract is going to specify what happens. But this is very much, on the ground as they are accessing and implementing the system on site or remotely for you.
All right. Well, intellectual property and trade secrets. I know you touched a little bit on that earlier, Marcus. If you want to chat about that a little bit right now, IP.
Yeah, I mean, so again, we're talking about this social process, and we're talking about the consultants having access to data, and how does the data break down, right? And what kind of buckets is it going to be in? You want to make sure that within your contractual framework that you're using to manage these individuals, that you have thought about what constitutes your intellectual property. What kind of protections are you going to put in place to safeguard that intellectual property from them? God forbid, they are accessing your IP, they've copied it, now they're using it and implementing it across their own customer base without your authorization. The same thing with the trade secrets. You've got to think about what kind of process you're going to put in place to manage their cybersecurity obligations. Is it what regulations are they going to have to comply with? You've got this expanding, global regulation and legislation network, and like I said, it's primarily GDPR and CCPA. And if you're going to, be mindful of these regulations and the legislation that's applicable to what they're doing for you, you've got to make sure that it's referenced with a high level of specificity in the contract, and that they have an obligation to comply with those. And there's certain magic words in very few areas of law. I feel like there are certain magic words, but certainly in here there really is. I mean, you want to make sure that they have an obligation to comply with a data processing addendum or agreement that would be attached as an exhibit to whatever master services contract that you've got in place. Because if without that, and they are processing your information, you've just violated these laws, and you've got a lot of liability associated with it.
And I think it's also too, to me, that the second and the third bullet go together. They have merged now. I'm working a lot with my European team, and they're responding to issues of breaches and information requests from the GDPR arena. And what we're seeing is that all the work that's been done to lay the foundation for a secure business. It's not just about complying with the law. It's about what are you really doing in your business practically beyond the contracts as well. What are you really doing to protect that data? So maybe let's talk about that a little bit now. I think we're getting into the different types of issues that we can see. On the next slide, this is the sensitive data. Let's see, I want to get to the meat of the matter. Do you think we could go ahead a slide or two and we'll get back to this one as well? This is talking about the breaches, and I think we've covered this. I really want to get into this. Yeah, this one here. So let this, and we'll go back to the other ones because they get called out from some subsequent slides that we have. All right. So here's what we really need to be clear about. You should be very scared right now if you're in business. If you're in any kind of managerial role, or you own a business, or you're even an employee of a business, you should be very nervous about what's going on here. So these are, this is a list of the different types of attacks. And the first one is hacking. And hacking is just a general verb now. It used to be something quite specific, people trying to get into your system. But now it just is a general a verb or noun about how outside bad actors, as we call them, are trying to get into your system. And they do that through intruding, network intrusions. They can go in through hardware. So if you've got a certain router, say you've got your on-prem system because you don't want to go to the cloud yet, but you're using routers and you're using other types of hardware to allow your employees working remotely to come into your system. In that case, or you're just using an internal network, or even if you're in a with a cloud provider providing you storage, the equipment that they use actually can put them at risk. And it's becoming a constant battle to determine what hardware is actually able to allow bad actors access to your system. So it's not even like software that we can think about, things we can plan for, the actual hardware. And some of it is so scary that there were I'll call them bugs or access points actually put into the system at the manufacturing level, because this is manufactured outside of the country. And if you get one of those pieces of equipment that has that, or maybe we don't even know that equipment, remember we talked about the 90% we know about, but the 10% we don't? Well, some of that is probably in our hardware. So network intrusions can be software, or they can even be hardware intrusions right into your systems, going at your data to put other types of bad malware into your system and viruses into your system. Denial of service and DDoS attacks, well, that's interesting, because what that does is that all of a sudden, when we hear of people's websites going down, all of a sudden, there's 1,000 hits in 1 minute onto a website that maybe only sees 5 or 10 an hour, and all of a sudden you get thousands. They're using robots in order to attack a particular site. Now, why would they do that? A couple of reasons. One reason is because they want to take down a site for fun. They think they don't agree with your politics. It's a way that they're going to have a kind of, we call it hacktivism against you, and try to put your site down or make a point. But another reason that they do it could be a competitor too, just trying to mess you up. But the other thing that happens is they do it as a way to distract you. By sending in 1,000 messages, they kind of overwhelm whoever's providing your security. And while they're on their phones trying to deal with the fact that the network's down because nobody can get in, and your employees and your customers can't get in, they're quietly coming in the back door. So that's another reason that they do it. Cryptojacking, not a lot of people know about that, but I think you've all heard of cryptocurrency by now. And crypto mining is where there are people all over the world, companies and individuals, making money off of verifying all of those blockchain transactions, blockchain, cryptocurrency, all of that. It means that you have to have multiple parties that are reviewing the information. They don't necessarily see the information, but they have to review that's they can make those connections to assert, to affirm, to attest that was actually a valid transaction. It's really hard to do with it takes time and it takes computing power. So they steal your computing power. They put little bugs into your software, into your systems, and they use part of your computer processing power in order to run this massive effort of verifying all these other transactions. It's like a form of hijacking and stealing some of your energy for your system and running your system. Data theft is just the act of anytime anybody's out to get your data. We call that the technical term is exfiltration. I know you heard me mention it earlier. Phishing, I think everybody's got that by now and understands what that terminology is. But man, oh man, I bet you every week you're astounded by the real life, realistic way that phishing is working. Wouldn't you agree, Marcus? I mean, it's astounding.
It's absolutely amazing. I was watching a YouTube video the other day that was tracking how these people do this stuff, and it's just shocking the way that they prey on vulnerable people, old people, and incredibly aggressive, incredibly sophisticated methodologies that they utilize. It's shocking.
And within businesses, you now, even if you get a request from somebody, your boss or the CEO or someone in IT to provide information, and you're in your own company email, if it even looks a little bit odd to you that you're being asked to supply information or go to an external site, you should actually pick up the phone or go to a messaging system and say, hey, did you just send me an email about this? Because I bet you about half the time it's no, I didn't send that to you. And what they've done is they have now gotten into the system and they are pretending now or using your boss or your IT department's email addresses to actually communicate with you. And you think it's safe because it's somebody that you know, and it's not. So it's moved from Facebook and all of that stuff right into business offices. So it's something to really be nervous about. The malicious software and malware, spyware, viruses, all of that it's just out of control right now. And it is getting more and more sophisticated, as is ransomware. Okay. Once upon a time, ransomware would kind of lock up what you were using for your regular day-to-day software. And if you couldn't make a restore fast enough or you didn't have good backups, then you were kind of forced to pay the ransom or hope that if you did pay the ransom that they were going to give you back your access to your data. But it's gotten worse. Did you know that in 90 seconds, as little as 90 seconds from deployment or activation of whatever worm, virus, Trojan bot they put in there, that they can take control of your system and encrypt your data? Not only encrypt your data on your laptops or your servers, but they also have deployed through what we call longer dwell times. Okay, that means they're in your system longer than you know, and then they're in there and they're already have gone into your backups so that you can't restore from a backup because that's encrypted too. So remember I talked about London. We're really working on some exciting ways to foil those plans and how the proper procedure for backing up. So if you guys are getting ready to look at your data's disaster recovery plans and you really want to know, well, how do I really protect myself from ransomware? Then just reach out to us and we'll put you on the mailing list so you can kind of keep abreast of what's going on in that market. That's really, I'd say, one of the biggest concerns that businesses have today, because not only can they can steal your software, they can steal your data when they have it, but they also can lock you out of it, which means no customer transactions, no employee paychecks, no ability to create sales orders, check your inventory. That's the reality of ransomware today, and it is so sophisticated. And let's talk for a second about, how do you get in front of this? Well, the sad truth is, human beings now are not sufficient for this. So whatever security you have in place, I can probably be assured if you haven't looked at it in the last year, it is probably insufficient for the threats in the market today, because what we're dealing with is not guys in hoodies. This is nation state sponsored hacking and organized crime. They have put people through college, university to learn how to steal and how to infiltrate your systems. This is not an opportunistic market. This is using artificial intelligence sponsored by nation states who are our enemies, who are putting inordinate amounts of money into finding ways to get into your business or take down your business. That's what's going on today, and that's frightening.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking the level of sophistication. I mean, how do you protect yourself from a nation state attack? I mean, you don't, right? Or if it's an organized crime. I mean, I think the sad reality is, there's nothing you can really do, and you've got to pay the ransom and hope that your insurance is going to be enough to cover it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What's on the next slide here? We've got a question coming in, and let's see if it's going to be on here. Okay, so this is a great question. We have a question from Dom, and he says, fascinating discussion, scary. Who's responsible if we have this system in the cloud, and what's the role for the business side of the team? And do we just rely on these people who are doing the hosting and providing our cloud services? And I'd say, it really comes down to a team. You can't do this alone. You can't say, I'm going to turn all this over to whoever's hosting my ERP system, and I'm going to just trust that they're going to take care of everything. You really are at a point now in business where you have to be educated about what are the threats out there and what are the technologies out there, and then at least be able to ask the question of the people that are supposed to be protecting your data, please explain to me what you're doing and how you're doing it. And you need to revisit that constantly. So some of the things that we should be looking at are providers, whether it's a third party provider of our software. You want to ask, what certifications do you have? Do you have ISO 27K certification, 27701, CMMC? Do you have NIST certifications for the software? What are the redundancies and the backups that are taking place for my data? Do you have different locations for where you're keeping my ERP data stored in a cloud? Is it just in one data center, or do we have in different data centers? And how do we switch that over? Talk to me about how often you're pushing out patches and how long I have to test a patch that's coming to my ERP system. What patches are you going to push out? What updates are you going to make? So once you move to the cloud, if you're on-prem in an ERP today, you're all in with everybody else, and there's a lot to consider. I'm not going to tell you don't go to the cloud or do go to the cloud. Those are very individual discussions that third stage really has a lot of experience in. And as we go through and we help people with that, we get into the minutia detail associated with this, with the system integrators or the individual cloud-based software providers, looking at what their track record is for security and what provisions they have in place, and they are not all equal. And your needs may or may not mean that you are have to be overly concerned in one aspect of what they do or another, but there is a process that you follow, and you do that with a team, and then you get good advice. So if you're putting that ERP in, you're moving stuff around from the cloud, if you're contemplating, you have to really work with the team to make sure that you're well advised and you know what to look at. The software and hardware configurations, even though you might have some things on the cloud, you still have your own networks that you're maintaining. You probably still have some IT staff. Let me tell you, the poor guy or gal that got you through to where you are today is not the person that you should be relying on to protect you in this day and age here. You need to make sure that you have a constant review and a continuous improvement process for the threats at hand. You need to have monitoring in place, and you need to have action plans in place. Remember those things we talked about with GDPR and all that compliance? Well, guess what? That's a regulatory effort, but that is the same stuff that you should be looking at, even if you're not regulated or don't think you're regulated today, because they went through that effort and they put those rules in place and procedures and guidelines because they know that that's what keeps the bad guys out. So that's definitely something to consider. And the last one here, we talked about unsecured vendor environments. Like, wow, yeah, that's a big problem for us, right? Anytime the vendors come in and they're and you don't know who they are, or they can't verify for you, or there's no language in there to say that they verified that these are the only people that are going to be accessing your system, and they're only doing this in your system, or they're only doing this with your data. All right, and then go ahead. Sorry.
From my perspective, let me just break that down from a legal perspective in a very practical way. Okay, so it's the same thing that Daryl just said, but to answer the question broadly, right? Whose responsibility is it? There's two answers to that. There's the real answer. It's everybody's responsibility. And then there's the legal answer. It's what the contract says. Okay. Yeah. And so within the contract, if you have if you're getting into a relationship with somebody that's going to be managing, processing your data, you have to put all of those requirements that Daryl just referenced, maybe not all of them, but certainly, all the ones that are applicable to the transaction within the contract, so that there's a contractual obligation for them to do all of those things, because without it, you don't really have much recourse, right?
Right.
You're just dealing with kind of, nice to haves, and what if we would have asked for this, and this, this is what you should do. But you've got to be able to incorporate these obligations within the framework of the contract, so that the vendor has a contractual obligation to actually do these things, because without that, you don't really have very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good point. Yeah, it's definitely, if something does happen, that's where the contract comes out. And if you haven't specified, or at least had them reference a certain compliance level, or reference to an ongoing existing policy that's attached to the language in the legal document that you can actually look at, the buck stops with you, because there's nobody to hand it down to. So if your customer sues you because your data is breached, you better make sure that you've got that contract in place that says the person that is keeping your data had these obligations, and they have insurance for cybersecurity as well.
Right, exactly.
All right, let's see. I know we're running out of here. Let's see. Sarbanes-Oxley. Somebody's asking about. Can you click to the next one just so we can see here? Yeah, in terms of audit, we used to worry about just Sarbanes-Oxley and who had access to the data and whether or not they ought to be doing things, and that was really, honestly, more of a financial aspect to it. Those were the good old days, right back in the day, when we used to worry about SOX, and that was our biggest headache that we had. Are we in compliance with that? And I think general controls for audit and IT, I got to tell you, I think we've even moved beyond that. It is now, you really need to be looking at the higher level compliance bodies, regulatory bodies of rules out there, like ISO, like CMMC, like ITAR, and really just looking at, does this matter to me, and getting very specific about that. IT audit and internal audit, well, you know what? They're only as good as the people that you have and how up to date they are. It has changed, and there really aren't a lot of people. But to that point, bringing in and having a team that can audit you, I wouldn't say that it's just IT general controls. I think you as you as in the business have to look at your overall system. So you could have an SI who's trying to keep your data safe, or and I'll tell you, the SIs don't do this. They barely even care about the data that you're putting into your ERP system, and now you want them to care about your data security. It's not who they are. They'll talk about it within context of the ERP, but what I hope is coming across here is that this is involving people within your organization, and then this is also involving another third party, which I really want you to think about, your managed services provider. Who is helping you with your security? Because you can't do it alone anymore, not unless you're a really, really big company, a large company, very large, medium-sized company, and you have in-house staff, and even they should have a CISO in place. And if you haven't looked at a virtual CISO, you should be looking at that, because that's the role that really helps you with kind of fractional advice, fractional part-time person who's trained to assist you in all the aspects around protecting your data. So when we talk about that last comment there, it's not just the business internal IT team, it's not just your SI, it's not just your internal audit. It really should be that in conjunction with your info security or your CISO. And if you don't have a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, you can rent one. It's called a fractional or virtual. Happy to give you more information and some referrals on that if you need it. But that's really the body, the person or the group or team that's really going to help you sort through this. And then a lawyer like Marcus assisting you with that SI contracts. Your SIs and your ERP is what's going to do it. This screen here, I know we're pressed for time. We get all excited about this stuff, but this screen here talks about people, and this is why it's not just about your SI, because it's really probably not the technology that's the problem. It's the disgruntled employee that's stealing your data, who is putting a thumb drive. Look at everybody, look at the computer that you're on. Just put your head on the side and look at the thumb drive port, or USB port, okay? If you can put a flash drive in that, you're not secure. You're not. Because anybody in your company can inadvertently either extract data, well, that would be on purpose, right? Or take data off of your system and put it onto their other system, or put it into their personal Dropbox, or email it to themselves so they can work from their husband's computer over the weekend. Or you can be on a flash drive that gets inserted innocuously from a cell phone being plugged in, or any kind of data transfer device where you're now inserting viruses into your system. So if I go into a company and they can still email files to themselves externally, and they can still insert flash drives into their system, or get pictures from their phone by plugging into their company laptop, I know they're not secure. Okay, so that's a measure for you now. So it's about people. It's about people. They're usually the ones you have to worry about. They're the ones that either on purpose or inadvertently are exposing you. And then, of course, during ERP implementations, the exposure gets wider, because everybody's like so busy. There's data everywhere. You know, Sue, work on that this weekend. So email that to this guy because I know that file needs to be updated. And we all let down our guards, and we let in a small army of people to assist us with this. And we don't know who those people are. And we don't know who are trying to come into your organization from that army that's working. If I were going to steal from a company and steal a customer list, or try to really understand what a company was doing, I would be involved in their ERP implementation because it's such chaos. That's where you go, right? Because you just know that you can't maintain the rigor that you might have during a steady state for that. Next one. This is the standard stuff I think that we're all seeing, but unusual business practices. Okay, so let me tell you one more scary thing. You guys can all read the screen here. All right, two-factor authentication. If you're not using it on every application that you have today, I'm sorry, then you're behind the scenes. There's some really good software that we can recommend if you're a company that's kind of mid-market and you want to know how to do this without having to log in 100 million times. There's some good software out there that we can make recommendations for you on. So just drop me a line after the fact and we can help with that. And then also, you know, I think it's really important to understand that there's AI. Artificial intelligence is being used against you. That's where the market is right now. So there's no way that you're going to be able to see and understand and perceive all the threats that are coming at you. And even if you have that, if you don't have automated responses, so here you are dealing with artificial intelligence being deployed at you from around the globe to get into your system. And once successful in there, that we talked about 90 seconds it can take over to virtually any meaningful data inside your entire company. Okay, there's not a human being, you know, Joe in IT, oh, I've got a threat, let me do something about it. By the time Joe picks his phone up, unplugs it, looks at it, and starts tapping and starts to do the process of trying to lock down things, disconnect, draw bridges up, or whatever it is that he's doing, it's too late. it's too late. It's that fast. So really, you're talking about a new breed of software coming in that's necessary, that what we did 2 years ago is no longer sufficient anymore. And I think you guys can see it with the SolarWinds that we talked about. Look at that. Oh my goodness. Here we are, the trusted company to deploy all these vulnerability patches and all our updates on our core Windows systems. It's SolarWinds. That's what the purpose of SolarWinds are. And here it is, walking in with the Trojans through the front door with SolarWinds, and there it is. It's in your system. However, if you had a good CISO and a good team to assist you in advising you in what are the frontline protections for that, so that you can make sure that before any role-based permissions get changed, that those are checked first, that you're not allowed to have just changes in your access and permissions in your system. You got to at least tightly control that across your whole organization. That would have prevented a lot of these companies from being damaged by SolarWinds. They couldn't prevent it from being attacked because that was another problem. That was somebody else. But once it got in, they could have prevented it by having a good security process in place and documentation and process of human beings controlling what access they have to what system. So it almost does go back to like that SOX kind of original thinking about access, who has access to what and when, and role-based permissioning. That really, in my opinion, and what I'm hearing in the market, is really at the core of what it is that we're trying to do. But then being able to react to that instantly and say, hey, whoa, something just changed, or it's trying to change a permission. You have to have that happening in a real-time way, not a human being that's checking the list. The human being processes have to already have been in place and be taking place every day to prevent that.
Yeah, I agree. So let me kind of bring this down a little bit to, what can you do on the front end negotiation process? We talked about it a little bit, right? But in order to comply with GDPR with respect to processing data and having your SaaS provider or even your integrator deal with your data and do things with your data, there has to be a data processing addendum or a data processing agreement. It's a requirement of GDPR. It's a best practice under the California statute. This is something that you need to have an attorney put in place as an addendum, as an exhibit, as a schedule to the MSA, and there needs to be this language that really Daryl was talking about. That needs to be incorporated into the contact, into the four corners of the contract, that spells out what their obligations are, in addition to the data processing addendum. Then you want to have what I was talking about earlier, a substantive limitation of liability. So what's a standard limitation of liability? It's not going to work for a data breach. Okay, a standard limitation of liability for these contracts that we see today is something like the vendor will only subject itself to the amount of fees paid to them by you in the last 12 months, or the 12 months prior to the issue giving rise to the cause of action, right, or the lawsuit. Okay, and the way that's going to be set up is you will have front-loaded your software costs, so the fees are going to be maybe software-oriented only in the context of a SaaS provider, and so maybe you didn't pay anything, right, or the way that clock is going to work, you're not going to have a lot of remedy associated with the liability that you can recover. And so you have to carve out from that cap, that one-time fees paid cap, things like data breach, confidentiality, representations and warranties with respect to how they're going to treat your intellectual property and your trade secrets. And so that would mean then that they are outside of that one times limit, or two times or three times, whatever you negotiated, and it would be unlimited liability. That's where you want to be. It's unlikely that they're going to ever agree to that, okay? Because people don't want to subject themselves to unlimited liability in a contractual relationship, because that liability is going to far exceed, the value of the contract. So then what do? Well, you want to negotiate what's called a super cap, okay? And that's just a fancy word for a multiplier for these types of breaches or obligations that sits outside of the regular cap on liability. Okay, so you've got 10 times, or maybe it's a number. All right, and all of that has to be in relation to the value of the actual contract. The numbers that I looked at before giving the presentation today was that the average cost of a data breach is about $8 million. Okay, and are they going to agree to an $8 million liability cap? I don't know. It depends on how much negotiation leverage you've got, and that depends on how much money you're spending. If it's a $2 million contract, is it likely they're going to agree to an $8 million super cap? Probably not. But can you cap their liability at their insurance coverage? Maybe you can do it that way, right? So there's a lot of practical ways to go about this to make sure that when it all hits the fan and your data has been exposed and people are trying to sue you, that you can point the finger squarely at your vendor, and they have to step up to the plate with an indemnity obligation, a limitation of liability obligation, a remedy to a warranty, whatever it is, so that you have a prayer of being made whole when you get sued. So that's kind of the lay of the land and where you're at.
Marcus, you must be a very busy man these days.
Yes, it's
really changed in the last 3 years since we started working together. It's really evolved, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, it's a totally different world than what it used to be, and so I think it's exciting. It keeps us on our toes, and I think Adam said yesterday, if you're doing one of these deals, and from my perspective, and I guess it's a little bit self-serving, so you can take it with a grain of salt, but I'm not the one that said it, right? And if you don't have the money for a legal review of your contracts, then you probably don't have any business implementing the software, right? Because there's just so many gotchas in this, and it's old school things like what's a reasonable indemnity obligation for an intellectual property infringement, to all of these new things, all of the things that Daryl mentioned. Those have to be in the contract today, and you're not gonna see it, and some of this is like insurance. And you may not need it ever, right? That contract may not ever need to be leveraged, but it could be a ticking time bomb in your desk drawer, and somebody sues on it, and you realize you have no protection and all sorts of liability. So,
thank you so much. Go ahead, Daryl. Some final thoughts.
There's a spelling error here, but everyone, you can reach out to me and catch me if you have any further questions, or you're looking for some of that information on some specific things that I talked about. You can reach me through Third State, so just reach out to anyone there. They'll be able to get a hold of me.